somewhere in the mountains of Isfahan province, Iran. April 2026, a man is hiding in a crevice of rock, 7,000 feet above sea level, injured. Armed with nothing but a pistol, listening to footsteps that may or may not be getting closer. Below him, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is mobilizing. Provincial governors have broadcast a public alert. Iranian civilians have been offered the equivalent of $60,000 to find him. Thousands of search teams are spreading across the mountainside. He has been evading capture for over 24 hours. But here is the thing nobody knew at the time. While Iranian forces were hunting him across those mountains, a team of CIA officers was simultaneously feeding false information into Iran's intelligence networks. Fake convoy, wrong location, wrong direction. The Iranians were not just looking in the wrong place. They were being actively led to the wrong place, and the operation that ultimately pulled that man off that mountain, a midnight extraction involving over 100 American Special Forces operators, has since raised one of the most uncomfortable intelligence questions of 2026. Was the rescue the mission, or was the rescue the cover? Because 2 days before that F-15E was shot down, the Washington Post had already reported that the Pentagon was presenting President Trump with a highly complex commando plan to physically seize nearly 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium from an Iranian nuclear facility. A facility located in Isfahan province, the same province. The same week, by the end of this documentary, you will understand exactly what the verified record shows, what it doesn't show, and why the honest answer to that question may not be publicly available for decades. Everything you hear here is based on official statements, IAEA institutional reports, declassified records, and verified journalism from the New York Times, Washington Post, Axios, and Politico. No fabricated quotes, no conspiracy framing. Just what can actually be proven and what cannot. And later, you will see why the intelligence failure that haunts this entire story happened 45 years ago in a different Iranian desert, on a mission the IRGC has been studying carefully ever since. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to when their war was still invisible. If this is the kind of intelligence history that news broadcasts skip, hit subscribe and like this video right now. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps this channel keep making exactly this kind of deeply researched documentary. Now, let's get into it. For most of the last 2 decades, the conflict between the United States and Iran was a war fought entirely in the shadows, not with aircraft carriers and fighter jets, with sanctions and proxies and cyber weapons and targeted assassinations outside safe houses in foreign cities, with IAEA inspectors being denied access to tunnels, with satellites watching convoy routes and trying to construct meaning from vehicle movements, with human networks piecing together fragments, trying to answer a question that sounds simple but turned out to be extraordinarily difficult. Where exactly was Iran's enriched uranium? That question, the where exactly, inspectors have access, an underground complex is manageable. When they don't, it becomes something else entirely. As of late 2025, according to the IAEA institutional record, inspectors had not been able to independently verify the precise location of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile for months. Satellite imagery could detect vehicle movement near the tunnel access points. What it could not tell you was whether those vehicles were moving uranium inward, moving it outward, or moving nothing significant at all. In intelligence terms, that distinction is not a detail. It is the entire problem. Myth versus record, and this one matters. The standard public framing throughout this period was something like, Iran is enriching uranium. The world is watching. Sanctions and diplomacy are the pressure mechanisms. That framing treats surveillance as equivalent to knowledge. It is not. According to the Institute for Science and International Security, one of the most consistently cited non-governmental analysis bodies on Iranian nuclear activity, their September 2025 analysis of IAEA verification reports found that Iran had created deliberate opacity around the Isfahan underground complex. The IAEA knew the HEU existed. It could not confirm with precision where every stockpile was physically located. Those are two entirely different things in intelligence and military planning terms. Knowing that something exists tells you what the threat is. Knowing where it is tells you what you can do about it. And by early 2026, the United States appears to have moved from the first problem to the second. In a March 7 report, Axios documented that the United States was actively considering a special forces mission to physically seize Iran's nuclear material, specifically the highly enriched uranium at Isfahan. This was not a think tank scenario. Axios cited multiple officials who confirmed that discussions between U.S. and Israeli counterparts had moved beyond theoretical into operational planning territory. 8 days later, the Times of Israel added a critical detail. Intelligence assessments suggested that seizing the Isfahan facility would require what former NATO Supreme Allied Commander James Stavridis described, when asked directly, as potentially the largest special forces operation in American history. Stavridis was specific about theoreasoning. The underground geography of the Isfahan complex, its air defense coverage, and the sheer logistical challenge of physically securing radioactive material without triggering a contamination event. This was not a small team operation. It required hundreds of personnel on site simultaneously with supporting aircraft overhead. That number. Remember it. Now here is where the timeline becomes genuinely significant. On April 1, 2026, exactly 2 days before an American F-15E Strike Eagle was shot down over Isfahan province, the Washington Post reported that Trump had been presented with what its sources described as a highly complex military plan to send U.S. commandos into Iran to secure close to 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium. According to WAPO's reporting, citing national security officials, the plan was under serious review. Not a contingency paper filed in a drawer. a plan on a desk, with a decision pending. What happened 48 hours later did not happen in a vacuum. Now, and this is critical, none of that proves that what came next was a uranium mission disguised as a rescue. It does not. What it establishes is that the operational intent, the institutional appetite, the logistical planning, and the geographic target were all documented and real before the shoot-down ever happened. That context matters enormously for how we evaluate every decision and every claim that follows. Because intelligence history has one consistent lesson embedded in almost every major covert operation, the most consequential missions SARE. Rarely the ones announced at press conferences. They are the onus that happened while the cameras were pointed somewhere else. In 1980, the United States launched a rescue mission into Iran. And what most people still don't know is that the catastrophic failure of that mission directly produced the Special Forces architecture that made the 2026 operation possible. That story is coming. But right now, in the first week of April 2026, an American jet was down. The pilot had been recovered, and somewhere in the mountain ridges above Isfahan, the weapons systems officer, the man in the back seat, was still out there, and the CIA was already running a deception campaign inside a country it had no official presence in. That is where we go next. On the morning of April 3, 2026, an F-15E Strike Eagle, one of the most capable combat aircraft in the United States Air Force, was operating in airspace over Isfahan province, Iran. What exactly it was doing there in terms of its specific tasking and mission profile has not been officially confirmed in any declassified or publicly released document. The US government has characterized the aircraft as conducting combat operations as part of the broader 2026 military campaign. That is the sum total of what has been officially stated about why that particular jet was in that particular piece of ski. What happened next is less ambiguous. Iranian air defenses engaged the aircraft. The F-15E was hit. Both crew members, the pilot and the weapons systems officer seated behind him, ejected. The pilot came down close enough to the wreckage that a rapid rescue effort recovered him within hours under fire before Iranian ground forces could reach him. That part of the operation moved fast and it worked. The weapons systems officer came down somewhere else. Now, a quick note on why that distinction matters and why most coverage glossed over it. In a two-seat F-15E, the pilot flies the aircraft. The weapons systems officer, the WSO, operates the targeting systems, the electronic warfare suite, and the advanced sensor packages. The WSO is, in intelligence terms, the more analytically sensitive crew member, not necessarily the higher value capture target in every context. But in a region where sensor data collection is itself a contested activity, the separation of those two crew members was not an inconsequential detail. The WSO had citing statements from CIA Director John Ratcliffe himself. The CIA did not simply support the rescue operation. The CIA was the operational engine that made the rescue possible. Ratcliffe confirmed publicly that the agency deployed human assets inside Iran and used what he specifically called exquisite technologies to track the WSO's location and monitor the Iranian search response in real time. The phrase exquisite technologies is intelligence community language. It means capabilities so operationally sensitive that naming them publicly would compromise either the technology itself or the programs that deploy it. It typically encompasses signals intelligence, advanced satellite tasking, cyber tools, and potentially collection systems that the public has no confirmed knowledge of. Ratcliffe did not elaborate, and he was not expected to. What he did confirm directly on the record in public was the deception campaign. The CIA, according to Ratcliffe's own statement, reported by Politikun April 5, conducted an active misinformation operation inside Iran-during the search window. The agency spread false information within Iranian intelligence networks, suggesting that the WSO had already been located and was being moved by a U.S. ground convoy to a different location. The goal was to redirect IRGC search teams away from the actual mountain crevice where the WSO was hiding, buying time for a rescue force to reach him before Iranian ground units did. Let that operational logic sit for a moment. The CIA was feeding deliberate disinformation into the intelligence networks of a country it had been in active military conflict with for weeks. This required, at minimum, existing access points inside Iranian communications or intelligence channels, because misinformation only works if it reaches decision-makers who trust the source enough to act on it. You cannot deceive someone who isn't listening to you. The existence of those access points, the human assets Ratcliffe confirmed, tells you something about the intelligence infrastructure CIA had already built or activated inside Iran before this operation began. These were not assets recruited in 48 hours. Pre-positioned intelligence networks of this kind represent years of investment, careful development, and meticulous protection. And now, in the middle of a shooting war, they were being burned to save one man. Myth versus record, and this one is important to state clearly. The instinct in much of the public commentary following the rescue was to dismiss the CIA's role as standard military support. A bit of signals intelligence, some satellite imagery, nothing extraordinary. The record says otherwise. CIA Director Ratcliffe specifically used the word deception campaign. He confirmed human assets were physically operating in Iran. He stated that Iranian forces were, his word, humiliated when they realized they had been deceived. That language is not standard praise for a reconnaissance assist. It describes an active, successful influence operation run inside a hostile state during a live combat rescue. That is a significant intelligence event by any historical measure. Now here is the part of the deception campaign that nobody has yet been able to fully account for. Ratcliffe said Iranian forces were humiliated when they realized the deception. That phrasing implies a gap, a window, during which they did not realize it. How long was that window? How many IRGC units were directed? Were any of those units pulled away from areas near the Isfahan nuclear complex? None of those answers are publicly available. The duration and geographic scope of the CIA's deception window inside Iran during those 48 hours is, as of now, classified. What is not classified is what the WSO was doing while all of this was unfolding around him. He was still on the mountain. According to the timeline reconstructed by the New York Times, the WSO spent more than 24 hours, and likely closer to 36, evading capture before the rescue force reached him. That is an extraordinary period of evasion in active search terrain. The climbing, the crevice, the survival radio, the management of his own location and movement to avoid discovery. This is worth naming as what it was, a successful individual survival and evasion operation in one of the most surveilled, most actively hostile environments imaginable. Inside a country mobilizing every available resource to find him. And it succeeded because the intelligence operation around him succeeded. The CIA's deception campaign did not just buy time in the abstract. It bought specific operational hours during which IRGC search coordination was disrupted enough that a man injured, alone, and armed with a pistol could remain undetected on a mountain 7,000 feet up in Isfahan province. That is what intelligence, tradecraft at its functional best, actually looks like. Not a briefing, not a satellite image. A man still alive because the people hunting him were looking in the wrong direction, for the wrong reasons, at exactly the right time. But the CIA's job was not finished when the deception held, because now the rescue force had to actually get there. And what that required, the scale of it, the physical footprint of it, the specific location it landed in, is what turned a remarkable story into the intelligence question that nobody in Washington will answer directly. Over 100 American Special Forces operators, multiple C-130 transport aircraft, Black Hawk helicopters, and a landing zone in Isfahan province, specifically near Isfahan, the city that holds the tunnels. That is where we go next. The rescue of the weapons systems officer did not happen quietly. That point needs to be made clearly before anything else, because of the initial public narrative, amplified significantly by a social media post from President Trump declaring, "We got him," in the early hours of April 5, framed what happened as a swift, clean, surgically precise extraction, a triumph, a punctuation mark, the full operational picture reconstructed from reporting by the BBC, CBC, CBS, and multiple defense correspondents in the days that followed, tells a considerably more complicated story. One that raises questions the US government has not answered, that Iran has answered in jamming of potential ground radar, and a communications architecture capable of coordinating dozens of aircraft and over 100 personnel in real time inside a hostile nation's airspace. The fact that this force entered Iran, operated for hours, and extracted the WSO is itself an extraordinary demonstration of U.S. military reach. But it is the specific location of the landing zone, and what happened there, that shifts the story from extraordinary rescue to extraordinary rescue with unanswered questions. Because the force did not simply fly in, grab the WSO off the mountain, and fly out. According to reporting from multiple sources, including the BBC and defense analysts who tracked the operation in real time, the C-130 element landed at an abandoned airstrip in Isfahan province. Not in a field, not on a road. At a designated airstrip, a prepared, paved landing surface capable of handling military cargo aircraft, located in the same province that hosts the Isfahan nuclear complex. Let that geographic fact settle. The U.S. Special Forces element secured and briefly occupied a ground position, a physical piece of Iranian territory with prepared aviation infrastructure in Isfahan province. While the Black Hawks extracted the WSO from the ridgeline, the C-130 ground element was on the ground at that airstrip. The United States has not released any statement specifically addressing the airstrip. There has been no official explanation of why that particular location was chosen over alternatives, how long the ground element held it, or what, if anything, occurred there beyond the aviation support mission. These are not unfair questions to ask. They're the basic operational accounting that has not been provided. Now we reach the point where the official narrative and the Iranian narrative diverge, and where the honest analytical task is to identify what can be verified independently and what cannot. During and immediately after the operation, U.S. officials confirmed that American aircraft sustained damage. Specifically, 2 Black Hawk helicopters came under hostiles' small arms fire from IRGC ground forces during the extraction phase. Crew members were wounded. This was confirmed by U.S. defense officials, cited in CBS News reporting on April 5. The operation was not casualty-free. It was not without contact. Those are the official U.S. admissions. What the U.S. said happened to the aircraft. They were deliberately destroyed by American forces on the ground to prevent their capture and exploitation by Iranian forces. This is a documented military practice. The destruction of disabled or damaged aircraft to deny adversaries access to sensitive technology, avionics, and communications equipment. What Iran said happened. The IRGC released footage of burned wreckage in Isfahan province, claiming to have downed 2 Black Hawk helicopters and a C-130 transport aircraft through combat fire. Iranian state media published the imagery widely. The IRGC's framing was not the Americans burned their own aircraft. It was we destroyed their aircraft. These are materially different claims. If the aircraft were destroyed by U.S. forces in a controlled demolition as part of standard protocols, that is a planned extraction under fire, If the aircraft were downed by IRGC action, that represents a combat loss significantly more severe than what U.S. official Shave acknowledged. Independent verification of which version is accurate is not possible from open sources. No neutral third-party aircraft damage assessment was conducted. Satellite imagery of the airstrip and surrounding area in the aftermath has not been publicly released in a form that resolves the question, myth versus record. And this one cuts in an uncomfortable direction for the clean victory narrative. The myth, reinforced by the "we got him" framing and the genuine relief of a successful rescue, was that this operation was a demonstration of flawless U.S. Special Operations capability, executed without serious complications. In and out, the record, based on official U.S. admissions, shows helicopters were hit by hostile fire, crew members were wounded, aircraft were destroyed on Iranian soil, and the operation involved over 100 personnel in sustained ground contact with IRGC forces in Isfahan province. That is not a criticism of the operation or its outcome. The WSO came home. That matters enormously. But describing it as clean is not accurate, and accuracy is what allows us to understand what the operation actually required and what it actually demonstrated. Here is the element of this that has the most significant analytical weight. The scale of the force deployed: over 100 operators, multiple C-130s, multiple Black Hawks, an occupied airstrip in Isfahan province, matches, in rough operational terms, the lower threshold of what military analysts had said would be required to conduct the Uranium Seizure operation. Not the full-scale version, not Stavridis's largest special forces operation in history scenario, but a proof concept, a demonstration that U.S. forces can enter Isfahan province, land at a prepared aviation facility, hold a ground position, sustain contact with IRGC forces, and extract under fire. Former NATO commander Stavridis had told reporters in March that the Uranium Seizure would require forces operating inside the Isfahan complex itself, a far larger and more defended target than an abandoned airstrip. But operational doctrine does not require the final mission to look identical to the rehearsal. What the rescue operation demonstrated, whatever its stated purpose, is that the insertion and extraction architecture works in this specific geography. That is not a conspiracy claim. That is an operational inference from documented facts. And it is the kind of inference that intelligence analysts make every day, not because they know what the intent was, but because they are required to assess what the capability demonstration implies about future intent. Iran's intelligence services drew exactly that inference, publicly and loudly, on April 6, Iran's Foreign Ministry spokesperson. Esmail Bagay stated that the possibility that this was a deception operation to steal enriched uranium should not be ignored at all. Iranian leadership compared the operation explicitly to a deliberate cover mission, drawing the distance between that airstrip and the Isfahan nuclear complex tunnel entrance. That precise figure is not publicly available in verified form. What is publicly available is that they are in the same province. They were active in the same 48-hour window, and the U.S. government has chosen not to elaborate on the airstrip's operational significance. Silence is not evidence of a secondary mission, but silence is also not exoneration. This operation, its scale, its location, its timing, its aircraft losses, and its burned footprint on Iranian soil, is the physical manifestation of everything that had been building in the intelligence and policy architecture for months. And to understand why the uranium question is not going away, you need to understand the plan that was already on the table before the first aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace. That pre-existing plan, the Washington Post's April 1 report, the Axios timeline from March, the specific weight, nearly 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium, and the specific geography, Isfahan. That is where we go next. There is a specific discipline required when analyzing an event like this one. An event where the stakes are high, the information is incomplete, and both sides have institutional incentives to tell incomplete versions of the truth. That discipline is this: follow the timeline, not the narrative, not the framing, not what officials said after the fact when reputations and geopolitical positions were already in play. The timeline, what was reported, when it was reported, by whom, and based on whose confirmation. Because timelines do not lie the way press statements can. They simply record when things were said and when things happened. And sometimes that sequence is the most important fact of all. So let's follow this one carefully. The timeline begins, for our purposes, not on April 3 when the F-15E went down. It begins weeks earlier, in the middle of March 2026, when American and Israeli intelligence and defense officials were reportedly engaged in active discussions about one of the most operationally ambitious ideas to emerge from the 2026 Iran conflict, the physical seizure of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. On March 7, Axios reported, citing multiple officials, that the United States was weighing sending special forces to physically seize Iran's nuclear material. The specific material in question, the highly enriched uranium stored at the Isfahan complex. The specific challenge, the underground tunnel network at Isfahan that IAEA inspectors had already lost reliable access to. The specific question being debated in planning sessions. Could U.S. forces go in, secure the HEU, load it onto aircraft, and remove it from Iranian territory before Iran could mount an effective armed response? That is not a diplomatic discussion. That is an operational planning discussion. And the fact that it leaked to Axios, a Washington outlet with strong national security sourcing, tells you that it was not a fringe idea circulating among junior staffers. It was being considered seriously enough that the people involved were willing to let it be known that it was being considered. 8 days after the Axios report, the Times of Israel added the scale dimension. Citing defense and intelligence sources, The Times of Israel reported on March 15 that seizing Iran's uranium would require what could be described as the largest special forces operation in American history, not because the facility was impossibly defended, but because physically securing, packaging, and moving highly enriched uranium without creating a radiological incident requires specialized personnel, specialized equipment, and a logistical footprint that dwarfs a standard direct action raid. The uranium itself is the operational constraint. You cannot put HEU in a duffel bag and load it onto a Black Hawk. It requires shielding containers, radiation protection protocols, loading procedures that take time, and transport aircraft capable of carrying the weight and the shielding. All of that has to happen while ground forces are simultaneously holding the perimeter of the facility against an IRGC response. The Times of Israel reporting, citing James Stavridis directly, put the required personnel count at the Isfahan facility itself at over 1,000 operators for the full-scale version of the mission. That figure, 1,000 operators at Isfahan. The rescue operation used over 100. These numbers are not the same, but they exist on the same operational spectrum, and the rescue operation, as we have documented, included a ground element at an abandoned airstrip in Isfahan province that no official has publicly accounted for beyond its role in the aviation support mission. Now we arrive at the most consequential entry in the timeline, April 1, 2026. 2 days before the shootdown, the Washington Post published a report, cited in the days that followed by analysts, lawmakers, and Iran's foreign ministry alike, describing what its sources characterized as a highly complex military plan that had been presented to President Trump for consideration. The plan, according to WAPO's national security reporting, involved sending U.S. commandos into Iran to secure and remove close to 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium. The geographic target named in the reporting, Isfahan and Natanz. 2 days later, the F-15E went down in Isfahan province. This is the timeline. These are the documented facts. And this is where the honest analytical obligation is to state clearly what the timeline does and does not prove. What it proves: that the operational intent, the geographic targeting, the institutional planning process, and the specific material objective. Isfahan, HEU, Special Forces, physical seizure, were all documented and verified before the shootdown occurred. This is not a retrospective Iranian claim built on speculation. It is an American newspaper, citing American officials, reporting American planning 48 hours before American forces were operating in that province. What it does not prove that the rescue operation was a cover for a uranium seizure. No reporting has confirmed that uranium was removed from Iran. No independent source has documented a secondary mission embedded within the rescue operation. The U.S. government has denied that any IAEA reporting documented in February, Iran had already been moving materials near the Isfahan tunnel access points. The closure problem was real. The window was narrowing. And the president had a plan on his desk. 2 days later, an aircraft went down in Isfahan province. What the decision record shows for those 48 hours between the WAPO report and the shoot-down, whether Trump approved, rejected, or deferred the seizure plan, is not publicly available. That is not evasion. That is the factual boundary of the open source record. Now let's talk about Iran's claim, honestly. Iran's foreign ministry, through spokesperson Esmail Baghaei, made a specific assertion on April 6 that the rescue operation may have been a deception mission designed to provide cover for uranium seizure. Iranian state media amplified this framing widely. The instinct in Western coverage was to treat this claim as Iranian counter-narrative, propaganda designed to reframe a military humiliation as an Iranian intelligence success, and that instinct's real basis. Iran's government has strong domestic and international incentives to reconstruct what happened as a secret defeat of a U.S. deception, rather than a straightforward failure to capture a downed American airman. But here is what the analytical record requires us to acknowledge. Iran's claim is not built on fabricated evidence. It is built on the same open source reporting that every journalist and analyst with an internet connection could read. The Washington Post's April 1 report, Axios's March 7 report, the Times of Israel's March 15 report. Iran's foreign ministry cited the pre-existing uranium seizure plans. Plans documented in American newspapers, attributed to American officials as the foundation for its assertion. You can disagree with Iran's conclusion, but you cannot accurately describe the evidentiary basis of their claim as invented. It is not. It is grounded in publicly verifiable reporting that predates the operation. Myth versus record. The myth, which has circulated in some commentary, is that the uranium seizure question is an Iranian disinformation invention designed to muddy the waters around a straightforward rescue. The record, the uranium seizure plan, was first publicly documented not by Iranian state media, but by Axios, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, citing American national security officials. Weeks before the shoot-down, Iran's foreign ministry read those reports. So did every defense ministry in the world. The question Iran asked after the rescue is the same question those reports logically raise. That does not make the answer yes. It makes the question legitimate. There is one final element of this phase that deserves careful attention, and it concerns what neither side has said: the WSO. The man who was rescued. In the days following his return, no U.S. official statement, no press conference, and no background briefing to reporters has addressed what the WSO observed, recorded, or transmitted during his 36 hours on that mountainside. Beyond the operational details required to explain the rescue itself, the WSO's survival radio was active. His position was tracked. He was in communication with rescue coordinators during the final extraction window. what he reported during those communications, what intelligence's sensors may have collected on the mission that brought him to Isfahan province, and what, if anything, he was tasked to observe during the operation's approach are details the public record does not contain. This is not a suggestion that he carried a secondary mission. It is an acknowledgement that the public record has a significant gap precisely where the most consequential intelligence details would sit, in intelligence history. Gaps of this specific kind, where the most sensitive operational details are absent from an otherwise tailed public account, are the normal signature of classified activity. That is not evidence of wrongdoing. It is simply how classification works. The things that matter most are the last things released, if they are released at all, which brings us to the historical layer that gives this entire story its proper weight, because 2026 is not the first time the United States launched a major rescue operation into Iran with questions trailing behind it about what else may have been on the agenda, and the lessons of what happened the last time. The lessons the IRGC has spent 4 decades studying. The lessons that produced the very command structure that executed this rescue are the missing context, without which none of this makes complete sense. That story begins in 1980 in a desert staging area with 8 dead Americans and a failure so complete that it restructured the entire US military. And it ends with a question about whether what we just watched in Isfahan province in April 2026 was, in some meaningful sense, the operational answer to that 45-year-old disaster. If you want to keep following this intelligence trail, every layer of it, every case file, every declassified document, hit subscribe right now. There is more coming from this channel, and the next documentary in this series picks up exactly where the hardest questions lead. That is where we go in the final part of this documentary. April 24, 1980, 8 American servicemen are dead in a desert in central Iran. 3 helicopters are burning. A mission that was supposed to rescue 53 American hostages held in Tehran has collapsed before it even reached its target. The operation, code-named Eagle Claw, has failed at a remote staging area in the Iranian desert called Desert 1 before a single Delta Force operator reached the capital. The images of those burning aircraft in Iranian desert sand became one of the defining images of American military vulnerability in the 20th century. Iran's revolutionary government displayed the wreckage publicly. Ayatollah Khomeini called it an act of divine intervention. Jimmy Carter's presidency never recovered from it. And in the 45 years since that night, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has studied Eagle Claw with the methodical attention of a student who intends never to be surprised by the same exam twice. They have not been passive observers of American military evolution. They have been active students of US Special Operations Command. SOCOM, the unified command structure under which the 2026 rescue operation in Isfahan province was planned and executed. The organization that rescued the WSO from that mountain crevice exists because of the men who died in the Iranian desert in 1980. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a documented institutional lineage running directly from one operation to the other. Now consider the doctrinal connection. The Air Force Historical Support Division's published account of Operation Eagle Claw notes that one of the key lessons incorporated into subsequent special operations doctrine was the necessity of building sufficient operational redundancy. Enough aircraft, enough personnel, enough alternative assets to absorb losses and continue the mission. Eagle Claw failed in part because when helicopters fell below the mission minimum threshold, there was no reserve. The force had been sized to the minimum requirement with no buffer. The 2026 rescue operation was not sized to minimum. Over 100 operators, multiple C-130s, multiple Black Hawks, an airstrip secured as a staging node, whatever else that operational scale represented. It was not the lean, minimum footprint thinking that contributed to Eagle Claw's failure. The 2026 force was built with buffer. It was built to absorb contact and continue. And the IRGC recognized this immediately. Iran's framing of the 2026 rescue. The foreign ministry's insistence that the operation was a deception mission. The public display of burned aircraft wreckage. The immediate comparison to an American cover story follows the same counter-narrative template Iran has deployed after every U.S. military action since 1980. This is not to say Iran's claims are false. It is to say they are consistent with a 45-year institutional pattern of reframing U.S. military operations in Iranian territory as intelligence defeats for Washington. Regardless of the actual outcome, Iran's government has never officially acknowledged that Eagle Claw failed on its own terms. The official Iranian framing of 1980, Wasthat divine protection and Iranian vigilance, repelled the American invaders. The official Iranian framing of 2026 is that the IRG uncovered and disrupted an American deception operation. Both framings serve the same domestic institutional purpose. Both may contain elements of truth. Neither can be taken at face value without independent verification. And independent verification, in both cases, runs directly into the wall of classification on the American side and information control on the Iranian side. Now, the nuclear intelligence thread that connects all of Thisto, a longer history. Modern U.S. intelligence on Iran's nuclear program did not begin with satellites, or CIA case officers, or NSA intercepts. It began, in its current form, with a political opposition group that most Western governments had designated as a terrorist organization. In August 2002, the Mojahedin-e information about the location and status of Iran's HEU stockpile. The IAEA had lost inspector access. Satellites could track vehicle movement, but not material movement. Human networks inside Iranian facilities would be the closest thing to ground truth available. Whether those networks reported anything about uranium movement during the 48-hour window of the rescue operation is not publicly known. Whether that reporting, if it existed, influenced any decisions made during the operation is not publicly known. The classification boundary runs precisely through the question this documentary has been asking since its opening minutes. Now, we reach the verdict, and the verdict requires honesty about what honesty can actually deliver here. Here is what the documented record allows us to conclude. 1. The uranium seizure plan was real. It was documented by multiple credible American outlets, citing American officials before the shootdown. It was geographically specific to Isfahan. It was under active consideration at senior levels of the US government as late as April 1, 2026. 2. The rescue operation occurred in the same province, in the same operational window, and at a scale broadly consistent with the lower threshold of what analysts had described as required for a uranium seizure operation's insertion and extraction architecture. 3. The CIA confirmed it ran a live deception campaign inside Iran using human assets and advanced technologies, an intelligence operation of a sophistication that required pre-positioned human networks, not improvised support. 4. U.S. forces secured and briefly occupied an abandoned airstrip in Isfahan province. The proximity of that airstrip to the Isfahan nuclear complex tunnel system has not been officially addressed. 5. No public reporting confirms that uranium was seized or removed. No independent source has documented a secondary mission within the rescue operation. The U.S. government has denied any secondary mission occurred. Here is what the documented record does not allow us to conclude. It does not allow us to conclude that the rescue was a cover for uranium seizure. The evidence for that conclusion is circumstantial, based on proximity, timing, and scale, all of which are real and documented, but none of which constitutes direct evidence of a secondary mission. It does not allow us to conclude that the uranium seizure was definitively ruled out during the operation. The classified operational record is unavailable, could not. Denials from the government of a country conducting an active military campaign in a hostile nation carry a specific and historically established credibility limitation, and it does not allow us to conclude that the question itself is illegitimate or Iranian invented. The question arises from American reporting, American planning documents, and American operational decisions, not from Tehran. Here is what the question itself reveals, regardless of its answer. In April 2026, the United States demonstrated that it could insert over 100 special operations personnel intelligence product of the entire operation, not a photograph, not an intercept, not a seized sample of enriched uranium. The capability demonstration itself is the intelligence signal. It tells Iran what is now proven possible. It tells American planners what no longer needs to be theorized. And it tells the rest of the world that the gap between a rescue operation and a nuclear seizure operation in Isfahan province is a matter of orders, not of capability. Plausible deniability as a concept requires that both explanations remain genuinely plausible, based on everything in the public record, the planning timeline, the operational scale, the geographic specificity, the CIA's confirmed human presence, and the abandoned airstrip that nobody in Washington will talk about. Both explanations remain genuinely plausible. That is not a failure of this documentary. That is the honest conclusion the evidence supports. And in intelligence history, honest uncertainty stated clearly is more valuable than false certainty stated confidently. The record is what it is. The question stands. And somewhere in a classification system that will not open for decades, there is a document, or several, that knows the answer. If this documentary gave you the intelligence layer that the news cycle skipped, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who wants the real story behind the headlines. Every view and every subscriber makes the next documentary possible. And there is a great deal more in this series still to come. The history of intelligence and war runs deep, and we are just getting started.